Turned Around, which was the first program I ever worked on, was such a lovely, nice program to work on that I was never happier. I'd come out from being a miserable academic and suddenly found myself doing what I wanted to do and having people recognize me in the shops and say, "Hello, Brian, I liked your story last night," about whatever it was. And of course, Turned Around was a very parochial program, so there was always a competition going on between the 4 centres. And at the end of the year, they ran a Turned Around showing items, the best of Turned Around from the 4 centres. And the people in Christchurch would all say, "Oh, this is the best." And that's how they felt about you. They felt, well, you were an advocate for Christchurch. And that was wonderfully satisfying. I think I was paid $16 an item to do that, and you got 4 items a week. You work it out, $64 a week. But it was just absolutely brilliant, and I got to know a lot about New Zealand because I was travelling. I mean, the district we served was not just Christchurch. We were down to Greymouth, the west coast, further north, Canterbury, and generally, and so on. So I got to know a lot about New Zealand, which was important. Quite soon, after I'd been on it, maybe 3 or 4 months after I'd been on it, my name started to appear in the papers a lot, and photographs on the front of newspapers and articles in magazines and so on and so forth, because people perceived me as being an aggressive interviewer, what in those days was seen as an aggressive interviewer. In fact, I wasn't an aggressive interviewer at all. I merely asked in quite a polite way the sort of supplementary questions that I thought needed to be asked of politicians. And that was the start of becoming famous in New Zealand, if you like, then. The NZBC was always on edge about the program. And they worried, We had programs there where we had threats that they weren't to be broadcast. I did an interview with Brigadier Gilbert, who was the head of the SIS, about the SIS interfering on campus and having agents on campus and so on and so forth. And I named some agents who were doing this. And he got very angry and came out of the studio, rang the Prime Minister, saying he wanted this program taken off. And that was probably in the 2nd year there. And the head of News and Current Affairs, a guy called Bruce Broadhead, who seemed to be the ultimate bureaucrat, stood up to him and said, "I'm sorry, this is our program, not yours, Brigadier Gilbert. If you want to have it taken off, you'll have to go to the courts." And in fact, in the end, that interview was broadcast, but with the names bleeped out, which made it much more interesting for people. Well, the interesting thing was that from reading what the 2 men had said, the Postmaster General and the guy from the Post Office Union, they actually seemed to be more or less on the same track in what they were saying, although apparently they were deadly enemies and totally opposed, and this go slow it really was, rather than the strike could never be resolved. They did seem to be saying the same sort of things. We want to sort this out, blah, blah, blah. And so we had a sort of expectation that we might pull this off. This, incidentally, is something that had never been done before and has never been done since, interestingly enough. And so it was really just a matter of playing devil's advocate to both sides, which is what you normally do in this sort of thing, and finally convincing them that really they were essentially saying the same things. And then saying to them, as we got towards the end of the interview, Mr. Reddish, who was the Post Office Union man, will you now go back to your members and recommend that they should go back to work? And Mr. McCready, who was Postmaster General, will you now go back to the Cabinet and say you think you've got a resolution here? And that wasn't actually completely done on the program, but it was done within hours that night. The first program, I think back on it now with considerable embarrassment. It began with me walking into the studio as though I were the Governor General, and in front of me, Amari is doing a welcoming, whatever the word is, I can't remember the word now. Pōwhiri, yes, a welcoming pōwhiri. And it was meant to be funny, but it was actually Grant Tilley who was playing this, and he was a ballet dancer who'd been called in to do the pōwhiri, which was the joke behind it, right? So from a race point of view, it was highly improper and insulting. But this was what we had in mind, that this was the sort of show this would be. So Grant does the pōwhiri, and I pull out a gun and shoot him and walk over his body. You can see this did not go down well with the Maori population. Then we had a lengthy discussion on homosexuality. in which we talked first of all about male homosexuality, then about female homosexuality, and these interviews were incredibly specific. So they were, so what do you male homosexuals do, right? And then of someone talking about female homosexuals, so what do lesbians do? You know, and it was at that sort of level. And then at one point I remember asking the audience, had anyone in the audience ever committed sodomy? And the only person who put up their hand was a person who was a guest on the show, and that was Sam Hunt. And he confessed having committed sodomy. He was probably more honest than a lot of people. This was just so offensive, this whole show. If there was anyone left to offend, I have no idea who they were. And we had set out to do something that was dramatic and new and, you know, would bring television into the 20th century. And I received 2 telephone calls that night. One was from Gordon Dryden, who had managed to get through, which was amazing because the switchboards were jammed with protest, saying, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened to New Zealand television. And the other was from Des Monaghan, the boss, saying, be in my office at 8 a.m. And the next day, Truth ran a headline, a trip in the gutter with Edwards. Well, I think one of the reasons it was so popular so quickly was that it was something that had never been done before on New Zealand television. Indeed, the rules of the game in those days for television programs were not only could you not criticize a commercial product, you could not name a commercial product. So you couldn't, in the course of an interview, mention Cadbury's chocolates or something like that because that was against the rules. You couldn't do that. So here was a program that went much further than that. Not only did it name things, it criticized the people who'd made them or the products themselves. So what people discovered they now had was a goodies and baddies program, a cops and robbers program, you know, a cowboys and Indians program, where the baddies got their comeuppance. And that's always been the appeal of Fair Go, the baddies getting their comeuppance. Not always big stories, small stories, stories about toilet paper that was too thin or whatever. Toothpaste you couldn't squeeze. Well, it didn't matter, whatever it was, and some really big stories as well. And that appeal remained. I actually think that now Fair Go is declining, partly since Kevin Milne has gone, partly since new thinking about what it should be. And that sense, that community sense about the program, that it's a program for the little people, is sort of gone now. It looks flashy and it's not what it's meant to be. I was never a very good person. I was never very good with my nerves. And it was nerve-wracking because you knew that at 11 o'clock or around 11 o'clock, you had in front of you at least an hour and maybe an hour and a half of only partially scripted material. And the thing was that it's tremendously exciting and the adrenaline is huge. And when it works, it's absolutely wonderful. But when it doesn't work, you really feel down. And I used to go on the next morning, go searching for papers, what was in the press, what was in the Herald, what was in the Dominion Post or whatever it was then. And if the reviews were bad, I would actually be ill, you know. So the stress of doing that became much too much for me, I think. And in the end, I was quite happy to see it go. What we've got now are 2 very good programs, I think, Q&A on Sunday morning on TVNZ and The Nation on TV3 on Saturday morning and then again on Sunday morning. And these are good programs. There are intelligent interviewers, there are good panel discussions. The key issues in society and in politics are being discussed. But they're marginalized, these programs. I mean, they're somewhere where very few people watch these programs, very few people see these programs. And we're in an election year now. And most of the rest of the coverage that we get is tabloid coverage, really. I mean, you watch Close Up and Campbell Live. Now, these are described as current affairs programs, but they're not current affairs programs, really. They'll often have an ingredient or an element that has a current affairs base to it. But they don't provide discursive, you know, long interviews. You just have to have long interviews to make current affairs work properly. The day-to-day stuff of politics, what the government's programs are, how it's performing, what the opposition is doing, how it's performing, holding politicians to account. There's very little of that, really.